All right, we're back. We just finished talking about .NET, ASP.NET, basically, web forms, just as a reminder. And before we get into MVC, it's a little bit more complex, as you'll see. When you create a scaffold for .NET MVC, it includes everything that you saw in a forms scaffold, and then some, right? And that's the thing that you're going to get a lot of files. So before we get there, we have to start somewhere. And I want to start talking about the origin of MVC, why it was created, what's the advantage, what does it stand for. I mean, you've kind of, I don't think you guys have done MVC officially, right? So let's talk about it a little bit. And hopefully my PowerPoint presentation won't crap out like it did earlier, for whatever reason. That was weird. Yes, okay. So we're going to talk about this. If I can get to controllers, I will. I'll talk about controllers. I may not get to it today. It's okay, because we're going to handle controller models, views and models. It's kind of like, if you look at the book, what they say is it's kind of like talking about...
They don't want to listen to me. Go home. Come here.
Sorry for the interruption on YouTube. That was the best of Anju and her collection. Yes, I was going to say we have to. That's pretty funny. We're going to cover controllers, views, and models. And if you read the book, what they say is they say it's kind of like what came first, the chicken or the egg kind of thing, right? You can't. It's like you can't talk about models or views until you know controllers, and you can't talk about controllers without talking about models and views. So the way the book is broken out, if you look at it, each chapter is a different thing, but it kind of relies on each other chapter. So you have to kind of read them all and then reread them all. That's what I found. When I read the book, I was like, it tells you need to know the other ones before you understand this one, right? See what happened? Andrew started all this loudness. So what is this model view control anyway? It's been around for a while, 1979. That's when it started off. When it says it adds a small amount of extra complexity, I disagree. It adds a great amount of extra complexity, or a much greater amount of extra complexity. If you're not good with web forms and you don't like Microsoft scaffolds, like that you get strictly out of picking a template, MVC Pattern with Microsoft is way more complex. However, it's much more secure as well. There's other advantages to it, which as you'll see. So again, when you look at the general, this is the absolute general MVC pattern. You've got your model, view, and controller idea, where a model is a set of classes that talks about the data, right? And the business rules. We have to always remember the business rules. So I remember when I was doing things with MongoDB last semester, MongoDB and Mongoose and so on, we were also using a model, view, controller pattern. And one of the questions I always got was, well, how do I make this relational, right? Because in MongoDB is a NoSQL database, right? So like, but I want to, can I create relations with my MongoDB? Well, yes, part of the business logic, right? And you can do that in the model, whether they exist or not. You can create the relations, right? Now, because we're using SQL Server here, it is a relational database from the get-go. So you don't have to do that. You don't have to create the business logic in the model. The model includes other things that won't necessarily talk about the relations. The view. Again, we have different views, and it basically speaks to the application's UI. Now, there's going to be a difference between when we talk about view, general view, as opposed to what does the view look like from an MVC, ASP.NET MVC perspective. There's two different things here we're talking about. And then the controller. I like what it says here, where it says a set of classes that handles communication and all that kind of stuff, and application flow. That's good, because that's what it does. It passes through application logic, variables. It actually controls the flow from the data flow from the model into the view. That's really how I see it. It's almost like the middleman, if you will, middleware, right, is your controller. from an MVC as applies to our web frameworks, right? I mean, we're going to start using the entity framework. You guys did a little bit of entity framework, right? So I think it's really the way to go these days with Microsoft to use entity framework and move away from ADO.NET and you know, strictly using a SQL Server, right? It's better to go entity framework with that, and we're going to touch upon that again, and we're going to do that with, you know, keeping in mind that the way we manipulate things, the database, and all that kind of stuff, all the logic that happens for database manipulation happens in the model. We have a bunch. It's funny when you look at MVC pattern, and we see we talked about view engines in Express in the last movie and stuff like that, right? And even in AngularJS, they have a view engine for MVC as well. It's called Razor, right? So again, it's almost like it's as if we have parallel, you know, development on the Microsoft side as well as in these other open source technologies, right? So if you learn AngularJS, you kind of know MVC pattern, and you kind of know how to use a lot of stuff that you can do in MVC already. That's what I'm saying. That's why Angular and ASP.NET MVC go hand in hand so well, and that's where there's this ladder section in our book that kind of handles that. And from a controller perspective, again, we're going back to how I mean, it renders the view. It helps us render the view, and it goes through the application server to grab information from IS and throw it into the view. It's really funny. MVC hasn't been around for that long, right? Now this says it was the first version was released in March of 2009, and each major release has happened over the last little while. Actually, they all sync up with the major releases of Visual Studio, the Visual Studio program. If you go back to Visual Studio 2008, 2009, every major release of Visual Studio, the reason why they released it is for MVC, right? It's really weird. So Visual Studio 2013, MVC 4.5.1, right? And that's how it goes. Almost every major release. And they've added additional functionality. Now, I'm not going to read all this, but basically there's this guy on a plane, right? This guy, Scott Guthrie, right? He's one of the Microsoft guys, and he's flying, you know, and he's figuring this stuff out. Basically, he developed MVC, ASP.NET MVC on the plane. When he landed, it was kind of his beta was ready to go, right? It must have been a long flight because, you know, to me, I couldn't have done it unless I flew around the world a couple times, right? So he was pretty darn good. When he landed, he was ready to go with almost like a pre-release, a preview. MVC2 came afterwards. They added additional things, like, for example, this whole idea of UI helpers. I'm not sure if we're going to have time to hit UI helpers too much in our class because it's kind of a down and dirty detail for us, and it might be a little bit out of scope. And by the way, a lot of the concepts here we're going to touch upon in MVC, we're really, again, just scratching the surface because it's crazy hard. It's not easy to understand. I like the idea of this, you know, as you can see the growth as you look at each release. Like, for example, in MVC3, and again, this is like, again, about a year and a half, 2 years later, we're talking about, right? So we're probably talking about 2010 era, right? So Visual Studio 2010 came out. But between 2010 and 2012, they had MVC3 as an example, right? If I'm not wrong. And the Razor view engine, when I first saw it, I was like, wow, who would ever want to do that way? And if you look at it now, and I look at Angular or something else, I'm like, oh, this looks familiar. So when I was doing Angular, I remember the stuff from MVC Pattern, and I was like, wow, this is almost identical. It's almost like a ripoff of ASP.NET MVC. I'll tell you, Angular's easier, right? It's much easier than this, right? But only because from where I come from. Now, if you start getting into the ASP.NET or .NET technologies with the CLR and everything else, the common language runtime that includes C# and blah, 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 and whatever, then if you know C# really, really well, then MVC Pattern and ASP.NET applications should be like in your back pocket. In fact, if anything, if you know C# and ASP.NET, like I said before, you're super employable. Like there are so many jobs out there for that. More so, and nowadays, easier to get than even Java, right? Java, you get paid more, right? The jobs, there's not a lot of jobs in Java right now. We talk about the next one, and that's why we're going to talk more about the Razor View Engine as we go in. Again, the View Engine is it helps us build out our views, and it actually allows us to do these partial views, just like I don't know who's done view partials or view partials in PHP. You know, where you can break out different views. Of course, it's part of the stuff you've already done. You may not remember what I'm saying when I say partials. You may say, "What the hell is he talking about?" But you've probably, if you've done PHP and you've broken out your header and your footer in a separate file, and you've done includes, right, or whatever, that's what a partial is. A partial piece of your HTML. And the same thing goes with AngularJS or Express.js. You can do these partials, right? And that's what the Razor View Engine allows us to do. It creates templates, the same kind of idea, not exactly in the same way as you do with open source tools, and you know, it allows you to create views fairly quickly. So again, as we step forward, MVC4, if I'm not wrong, was in 2012. We came out with MVC4 and I think up to 4. I forget what the version is, but 4.5 came out in 2013, and then they updated it recently to 4.5.1. Now, the one thing is they came out with this web API. There was a real demand for services, RESTful services from Microsoft. Java handled it for a long, long time. For example, they use SOAP in Java, right? I don't know if you've ever seen that. It's really cumbersome. The whole language around how to create a RESTful service and use SOAP from a security perspective. And you create a web service, and you know it's very challenging to do so in Java. And here on the Microsoft side, much, much easier. And when they developed ASP.NET Web API, it kind of solved a lot of problems, or created a space for Microsoft, you know, for them to share their APIs. They're going to create a web service with others. And people saw it as a positive move until Windows 8 came out, right? Like Jean-Luc was saying it earlier, like, you know, oh, everything's fine. Windows 8 is beautiful, and we're going to make you happy, and it doesn't make you happy. Well, they started thinking about this in MVC4. How can we outsource? How can we start doing this this other stuff, right? But they've gone through a revolution in thinking. You can see how they've changed from MVC4 over the years into MVC5. Bundling and minification, I mean, it's almost like Microsoft's always been like a season behind, right? Minification's been around for a long, long time, and then Microsoft picked it up, right? It's almost like they included it in they assimilated it in their technologies, like the Borg, right? I talk a little bit about ASP.NET Web API here. It's kind of really scratching the surface about how it works. Again, a service that returns XML or JSON, so it can feed in data into a consumer. So there might be a consumer, like, you know, you create a service, and then let's say, for example, Jeff creates a service that he, you know, I can feed off his data from his database and include it in my, you know, in my website, and I can use an API. I can use his API to do that, and I'm going to get it in either XML or JSON format. You can create that. Before, we're using Windows Communications Foundation, which was what a pain in the ass that was, right? Still widely used, however, I have to say, still widely used. I'm not going to really talk about this too much because we're going to have it more on someone else. I'm hoping will be talking about it more. Right? So we talk about different ways, kind of an overview of ASP.NET Web API, and I'll leave that for the guys who are going to talk about it, which is going to be probably Jean-Luc. Display modes. One of the things that was included in the latest version of ASP.NET MVC was they have these display modes for where they use user agent string detection, right? So what kind of phone is coming in, right? So if this phone's coming in, display modes are used to almost make MVC and MVC4 and MVC5 more responsive to mobile devices, right? But again, now that they've incorporated Bootstrap, it's unnecessary. Bootstrap handles a lot of the front end. It's actually built in to a lot of MVC5 applications, and even the latest ASP.NET web forms, like you saw. So here are all the different things. And if you notice, ASP.NET MVC5 overview, you've got this idea of one ASP.NET, one ring to rule them all kind of thing, right? So you're not going to have more than one version of this. Again, if you see how it corresponded to this release of Visual Studio 2013, right? And then you have your ASP.NET identity to take over from member, right? It was a different form of security. And then, of course, all of our Bootstrap templates. For them to actually acquire Bootstrap templates, can you imagine those Bootstrap people made a lot of money, right? But Microsoft tried to pick the best. They could have picked Foundation, right? And Foundation is a very popular framework as well, front-end framework. But Bootstrap is now the de facto standard in mobile-first frameworks. And other things, authentication filters and so on. There's going to be some things we cannot cover here in the course that are just simply out of scope. They're just too low level for us. Not because you won't understand them, but because we're going to spend a lot of time. We might spend 1 hour or 2 hours out of the class talking about something that you may never see. Because it's just, you know, something that's rare, or they've included it as a feature because you need it for some application that probably we don't have the scope to put together. I'm going to talk about identity, but I'm hoping that when we talk security a little bit more in depth, we'll talk about how, when we get to the security piece, we move away from this ASP.NET member kind of, the way they did membership, to identity. That's the ASP.NET identity is the new way of authentication with Microsoft. And it allows us to do things like OAuth, where you can use things like you know, Google or GitHub or LinkedIn or whatever to authenticate yourself. Single authentication, yeah.
So ASP.NET identity is more for the social media
It
API?
hits everything. It helps you out with authentication in general, right? So we're going to hit that probably, I think week 5 we're going to hit that,
So
right?
if you want to, like a web app where you can sign in using Google,
Yeah, you can build it through it. They have the templates to build with ASP.NET. Yeah. But you have to create a provider. You have to go through that, and there's a whole. You have to get a token from your provider, sign up as a developer. There's all kinds of stuff to do. It's not just a simple thing, right? I also, at some point, although I didn't mention it earlier, now you just kind of reminded me, right? I also want to show you guys how to do SSL. I think it's really, really important. I'm not sure if Steven's going to cover it at all, or maybe you'll talk about it a little bit in your presentation. But what I'd like to try and do is I want to see if I can get some SSL certificates to play with, right? Because it'd be nice to see if we can put together a website with SSL and the difference. You know, the whole idea of authenticating, getting an SSL certificate. It took, I'll be honest with you, I've done it a few times, and it's always taken like 3 or 4 days to get it done, right? I don't know if you've done it, John, right? Because I know you're a security guy.
Oh no, maybe a payment to domain to get flag that they might give us one.
I'm very doubtful of that.
There's a
right?
shift. There is one.
In
It's shared.
in Azure? Okay, great.
Right.
It'd be nice if we had the ability to play with it. Yeah.
Yeah, the GitHub student account, you did,
An SSL certificate.
you
Good.
get certificates good for 1 year.
Awesome. Well, there you go. I'd like you guys to try and look at it, because there's different levels of SSL certificate. There's the one that turns your bar green, right? There's the one that has a different lock on the bar, right? And different things. And there's different liability, different ways of you know, creating a security for you, and different encryption levels. That's what it does. And they all cost different levels of money, right? Like, for example, the simplest one you can probably buy without a green bar, it still costs like into the hundreds per year, right? That you have to renew every single year, which to me is crazy. Yeah.
If you just are using a single subdomain, Stardust SL, they provide free 2-year certificates that you can renew. So
Where?
Start SSL.
Beautiful. All right, but if you want to do it for commercial use,
Yeah.
then can you use Start SSL for commercial use?
You can use Start SSL for commercial use as well, but
Okay.
it's just a single domain.
Yeah, so that wouldn't work for. That's why I couldn't do it. Like, I wasn't a single domain for it.
You can register as multiple certificates for different subdomains, but
That's the thing, right? Oh, you can.
Yeah.
So then why did anyone pay for certificates if that was the case? What's the encryption level on that thing?
let me check here.
Anyways, SSL, we need to know how to do it, and I think we talked about it before, how Google's rankings, right? How it affects Google's rankings these days. Eventually, for you to launch a website, you'll have to use SSL, right? It'll probably be a requirement. The HTTP standard will move on, right? And the problem with that is because there's just too much hacking going on. There's too much denial of service attacks. There's too much sites that are insecure that just bring down other sites and they're used for relay and everything else, right? So SSL is something like, it's almost like inoculation. We inoculate one, we inoculate them all, right? And if we keep on doing that with everybody, imagine if you create a site that's insecure, they hack into your server and they use your server as a relay, right? It's madness, right? And we should never allow it. So I think they're going in the right direction, but it's not for the poor, right? Because I think I like your thinking about SSL being free, Stephen, but I have a feeling that
Start SSL is free. It is a 128 or
That's why.
256-bit encryption.
256 bit too.
1 year validation and web server certificates and client mail certificates.
For how long? And then after the 1 year,
After the 1 year, you can
renew it for free.
renew it. Yes, thank you.
For free?
Yes,
Why is anybody paying? I don't understand.
it's a single subdomain.
I mean, if you can get multiple SSL certificates for each
But you
subdomain,
have to manage all those multiple subdomains.
It's thousands of dollars a man.
thousands of you know what? There's a
And it's
there's
also it's
there's
also
100,000 reasons why I'd want to do it. Right.
Also, the validation process is only your email,
Oh, that sucks.
only your server email.
So you may not really have a secure certificate then.
Yeah.
So they might
But it's
you,
enough to get a SSL HTTPS.
but it won't be. It may not be. Your domain still may not be trusted. That's what I'm saying. Because if you don't have the right authentication, you'll be asked, "Do you want to trust this domain?" Right?
Well,
Depending on the authority that trusts you. Right?
I've been using it on my website, and I haven't had a problem with it.
Okay.
StephenAWilson.ca.
No problem. Okay. Well, we'll look into it for sure. I think we have to. We have to look into it. Some of it's it's way better than a self-signed certificate anyway. That's for sure, right? We want to understand how to do that. So I think there's got to be a session we do on creating an SSL certificate and putting it up on Azure and playing with that whole thing, right? And now if we can't do it through what you're saying for whatever reason, I'd like to see if I can get a set of certificates we can play with. There's your login provider. So identity allows you, just to answer your question, rather than just focusing on username and password authentication, identity understands that users often use authentication through social providers like Microsoft account, Facebook, Twitter, and so on. So it allows you, it gives you that add-on, right? Which is super powerful for us, right? That's where we want to go. We want to use one single sign-on if we can. Although I'm not sure. Again, if you were to ask some people, there's critics of both ways, eh? Some critics say, well, that means if I hack your Facebook account, I can hack everything, right? And Facebook is told it's been hacked many times, right? And of course, we can add on identity through NuGet, right? So it's an add-on as opposed to it being always on. So again, the one thing I liked about the NuGet package manager when I first saw it come out, it was like finally they have a solution to compartmentalize our we don't have to add everything in. Originally, when we first started building C# apps and so on, even web apps with ASP.NET, or before that it was Expression Web. I cringe. It was like you either had all or nothing, right? It was crazy, right? And nowadays with this compartmentalized, these little packages that come together, you kind of build out your functionality in a piecemeal fashion, right? You choose what you want, like I said, like an Asian buffet, and then you leave all the rest, right? And so it scaffolds your application up as you need it. These are really big. See how what happened was it totally messed my PowerPoint. I don't know what the hell happened. I was totally running fine. And they talk about templates, and I want to talk templates a little bit because some of the templates they have, we use the empty template today. The web forms template, there's different templates you can use to start up an application. And the web forms template gives you everything. It gives you like a bunch of, almost like quite a bit of a scaffold. Same thing with web API and single page application. It does give you additional tool sets and files, but it's pretty fat. Like, so if you don't need all that, like if who's ever used, I mean, you guys have been using Yeoman for your projects and stuff like that, right? Or for Node, right? Some kind of scaffolding tool to scaffold up. No, you never did it. Whenever you use any kind of scaffolding tool, you have to understand the scaffold, right? So if you don't get it, if you look at the scaffold, go, well, I don't understand this. I don't know what this folder is for. I don't know what this file is for. Now you're going to be spending time more understanding the scaffold than actually doing any work, right? And it's always if it's not documented well enough, luckily Microsoft has very good documentation on their templates. You can spend a lot of time spinning your wheels. I'm not going to talk about authentication too much at this point. I'm going to come back to it by week 5. We're going to talk about authentication then. So let's take a look at MVC application structure, because once you build out, if you choose MVC as your pattern, you get all this stuff. Take a look. You get app data, app start, content, controllers, fonts, models, scripts, and views. And that's how it's broken out. You also have something called the web config file, as well as other things that you've seen there before.
You have to organize it like this.
No, that's how it comes. You can change up the way you like, but that means you have to make configuration changes. So that's what I'm saying. Sometimes a scaffold like this is a pain in the ass. It's better start with an empty web application and build from there, as opposed to scaffold. On the other hand, if you talk to some people who make enterprise level applications, they're like, no, we have no time for that. Because this has built-in authentication and has built-in everything, you have to build that all up from scratch the other way. So the fonts directory, because you start off your MVC, Bootstrap template system includes custom web fonts. Content is where you put your CSS. We kind of showed that today. App data is where you store your data files, like physically on the server, right? If you have a data file, for whatever reason, not a database file, a data file of some sort. Configuration code for routing and bundling and web API and app start. So that's part of it. In your controllers, you have in this particular case, you have a couple controllers here, your account controller and your home controller, and that, so your controllers folder holds your controllers basically. Views, it's similar to what we've seen in other model view controller scenarios where your views can be broken down into subdomains, like for example, account views, your home views, your shared views, and so on. And each view has their own, if you notice the extension is CHTML, CHTML being the view that you're looking at, a partial, more or less. So just a folder structure we're exploring right now. Content is, again, where your CSS files kind of lie. Look at this, CSS files. It's almost like there was a bomb in it was embedded in my PowerPoint, and when I opened it up, it just exploded. Right? I don't understand. It like blew it apart. It was perfect yesterday. It was like I could have sold it yesterday. Okay, today it's a piece of crap. Right? I could step on it and go, yeah. Bootstrap. You can see how the content is all the CSS files go in here. This is where Microsoft naturally puts it. So when you download something from NuGet Package Manager, it throws two things. All your CSS goes in your content, and all your scripts goes in all your JavaScript and stuff like that goes in scripts. So there's your jQuery, all that stuff. And you'll see this is a common thing. That's why whenever you see me building something for Microsoft, I'm always content because if I ever download anything from NuGet, it adds it right into my directory. It's already there. It searches for my directory. Does the content directory exist? Yes. Throw in my CSS, because if you do it the other way around and you build a CSS folder, it'll build a content folder anyway. So now you have two folders, one content folder, one CSS folder, and it's a pain in the ass. I'm going to stop there for a second and go back to looking at another template before I get into the controller's role and seeing how this broke. I don't understand. So we checked out this web form, right? And I want to create a new one, a new project now. I'm going to stop debugging. That would be nice. Let's check out what a MVC looks like. Okay, so here I'm going to go to ASP.NET Web Application. And by the way, if you notice, I have additional templates that I download, like this AngularJS single page application template that you can download if you'd like to. But for now, I'm just going to call this COMP3026, and it's lesson 1. I think it's part 4, if I'm not wrong. And press OK. This time, instead of going with an empty application, there's two ways I can do this. I can click MVC, like this. There's the checkbox for core references only. Or I can start building it out the whole MVC scaffold, right? If you notice what it says here, it says change authentication, right? This is what it was talking about in that PowerPoint presentation. You can say no authentication, right? I can include individual user accounts, organizational accounts, or Windows authentication. You can try different forms of authentication right here. And it says for applications that store user profiles in a SQL Server database, users can register or sign in using their existing account for Facebook, Twitter, Google, Microsoft, or another provider. It's built in. Let's press OK. And now let's press OK again. The scaffolding piece for this one takes, if you notice, it's taking quite a bit of time because it's building out the MVC pattern that we saw before. If I was to run it the way it is, without sight unseen, let's take a look and see what I got. It's forming for the first time. Right. Okay, so again, what do we get? We get a fully full-blown Bootstrap application, right? So it's responsive. That's the first thing you get with MVC5, right? I can register or log in. Let's register. So here's my email, right? So I'm going to say tom@example.com with a password. And register. It's good. It checks to see one's a at least one non-letter and one or digit character. Passwords must have at least one lowercase. Passwords must have at least one uppercase character, A to Z. That sucks. It makes it very complex for me to make a stupid password. And there we go. So I'm logged in. I can get more libraries from NuGet. I can look at my About page. Again, these are all partials. I'm looking at my contact page that's built out, right? And go back to my application name. I've got some bare bones functionality here. I can also log out. I can log in. And it says use another service to log in. There are no external authentication services configured. And then see this article for details on setting up this thing. The reason why you have to configure them is because you need to set up these tokens in order for the external services to work. So even if they put them in play, you couldn't use them if you wanted to. Let's take a look at the actual scaffold itself and see what's included. Like I showed you part of it, but I want you to see how mad it is. All right, so you've never seen this thing before, and I want to look at some views. And I would look at my account view or my home view. Here's my home view. I've got my About CS HTML, which is my partial. Let's take a look and see what that looks like. Again, here we're using the Razor view engine, right? What does it look similar to you? If you looked at this for the first time, have you ever seen something like this before? It reminds me a lot of some of those other things like handlebars, I'll be honest with you, or even it reminds me a lot of CoffeeScript. That whole, once I see the @ sign, that token being used, I'm like, wow, it's tokenized everywhere. When you see these, the view engine, right? So it says, hey, take this viewbag.title, whatever it is, and my title for the page is About. So it's going to take, obviously, the page, the main page, right, is listening for About, the title for the page is going to be an expression. So here's my view start. And here's my layouts, view, shared, layouts. And here's my layout.cshtml. And if I go to my title, here it is. You use the @ sign and viewbag.title, and then my ASP.NET application. So if I want to build out an additional page, right, then I would, in my in my partial, here's my partial, I would change my viewBag.title to whatever the page is called. Right? It's the same thing we've seen before, like I said, in other application frameworks like PHP, or if we've seen things like with AngularJS or the whole mean stack. They use a very similar syntax. But as you can see, there are quite a few files. And when you look at this, it can be quite daunting if you've never seen it before, right? Here are your code behind files, your CS files, your filter configuration, your startup authentication. It's broken out into controllers. I've got a few different controllers. One of them is the home controller. Let's take a look at a controller here, right? Again, what I'm doing is, what is it saying? It says return a view. So my action result returns the view that's been passed to it. Okay, and here's my message, your application description page, viewBag.message. So if I go into my layout.cshtml, right, I'm going to have a place that's going to show viewBag.message, right? Because we're going to take that message, we're going to kind of pump it out. There's my year. Take a look how easy that is to do year. At datetime.now.year, right? It's very interesting. So we're going to learn about this. We're going to learn how to create partials, how to create views. This is the fun part of ASP.NET MVC5, right? I think that the most challenging piece is how to do dependency injection, because there is dependency injection with MVC5 and so on. Those are the things that I'm not sure if we'll go too deeply into, only because of our time frame. And I think what I want to do is I'm going to pause it here for now. Next week, we're going to start off with these the students are going to start presenting, and I think we're going to start with Stephen, right? So Stephen, he's going to do like an overview of security next week. And then from there, we're going to roll. I'm going to kind of put together a schedule. Again, look online on Blackboard for notifications on all the stuff that you can possibly teach. We'll talk about the security piece for you, right? And then what's the time frame? When it's going to be coming out, right? And how long? Again, if you're chosen or if you select one of the topics, try and time it for around 30 to 45 minutes max with space for questioning, because again, we don't want to kill ourselves with a download, right? It's going to be too much for us to sit there. And if you can make it interactive, I know Stephen has an idea of making his interactive. The more interactive, the better. Okay. So that's it for me for this week. It's been the intro, and we'll see you next week with some real work.
No?
Yep.
Did you want to try a VPN?